All right, so we can get started. First of all, thank you for everybody for joining us today. My name is Adam Fisk, and I'm the Director of IT Services here at TSP. Today's webinar will be focused on IT security for law, and joining me is TSP's founder and president, Michael Lowe.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. And I think what we'll do is just quickly start with a quick slide about TSP. I think we have some current clients on the webinar today, and so some of this will be obvious to you guys, but for those that are new to TSP, so we're an IT support firm that's been in business since 1992. We work with a lot of firms from smaller SMBs within the Boston area to bigger names like Santander, the Celtics, Cell, and Kayak. But really our focus is on providing experienced IT support for a wide variety of organizations, and in particular organizations that have various regulations that they have to abide by. So it's part of our job to sort of keep everybody secure and compliant at the same time.
So today in our webinar, we're going to focus again on the current landscape of cybersecurity and how it impacts firms today. If at any point during the webinar, if you have a question or a comment, don't hesitate to click that Q&A button. I believe it should be at the top of your screen, or depending on your settings, at the bottom. We'll make sure we circle back to all of these by the end of our webinar today. So our agenda is going to be focusing on some of these big questions that we have around cybersecurity, and then delving into the 5 most common security issues that are showing up at all sorts of clients, but really specific to law firms. And then what can we do for decent security? And then landing ultimately on what our IT providers can do to help.
Great. So let's dive into the big questions. I mean, these are the things as a person within your firm, running things, operating things that you should be thinking about when it comes to cybersecurity. First off is, what data do you have to protect, and where is it? So of course, data has a lot of different sort of definitions, and we'll talk about that in a second, but looking at particularly around personally identifying information, anything with social security numbers, anything with account numbers that might really be considered, very sort of critical information. But of course, there's also just confidential client information. So understanding what that data is and where is it. If that data was stolen or lost, what would be the effect on the business, on the clients, and even the reputation of the business? What are the consequences of some sort of devastating attack or a data breach? And we'll talk about a few of those different scenarios. And how can you detect an intrusion and figure out, where it came from? And then finally, the question that you should ask is, do we have a plan for responding to an intrusion or a loss of data? We'll talk about this a little bit later on, but planning is such a big piece of cybersecurity and digital security that goes beyond the technology side of things.
And to Mike's earlier point, we'll definitely unpack this more, but as we go along, really, I would say, think about what data means to you and what it means to your firm, and how the traditional phrase of data has changed dramatically over the last few years.
So let's look at probably one of the more recent big data breaches out there. There's the data breach at Capital One that happened a few weeks ago, where over 100 million consumer applications were stolen, and that included a lot of identifiable information, things that somebody could use for identity theft. Now, obviously, your first reaction is going to be to say, but we're not Capital One. And of course, I mean, these bigger firms have huge resources and lots of sort of a big target on their heads, especially, firms that might store this information. But there are a lot of similarities with smaller businesses. And the one thing to think about is, even with larger businesses, they're actually dedicating between 8 to 11% of their IT spending on cybersecurity. And that's, I think, something that you can take, as a smaller business and say, well, great, we're paying money for IT support, but maybe we should invest a little bit of that budget into sort of the cybersecurity aspects of it, which obviously reduces your risks. So in the Capital One case, there was a lot of data that was in the cloud. So they had gone through a huge effort to move data from their servers into systems, that were sitting in the cloud. And, they had responsible security people that had secured things, but the everyday employees responsible for using those systems were not necessarily highly trained in security. And of course, I mean, that's a given. Not everyone can be a cybersecurity kind of expert. But what it means is that there was a way that somebody could get to that data from the public internet from an unintended source that sort of came sideways through the network. And that's a story that we'll see time and time again, even with, smaller companies. And, I think, Adam, you were dealing with a client, I think, last year that came to us after a ransomware attack that had actually a very similar kind of story, obviously at a different scale.
Yeah, 100%. The scale in this case was definitely different. They were only around 50 employees. But in this case, it was really the same kind of overall effect. They unfortunately were hit with a ransomware attack, which, in the grand scheme of things, I think really brought them down 100%. So the entire business was totally down for 3 whole days. That includes the local staff and remote staff, while all of their systems were being sanitized by the internal IT and TSP. So in this case, the issue came down to the most benign of reasons, which was somebody making a mistake and clicking on a link that they shouldn't have. So in this case, a kind of, and we'll definitely unpack this further, a machine that wasn't as focused on, it wasn't as kind of quote unquote important as a main workstation or a server, clicked on a link which infected the entire network. Now, in this case, the overall issue was actually urgency. It was speed, and not necessarily knowing the ramifications that would kind of knock down as this ransomware really infected the entire network, and not only infected their core servers, but also their backup servers.
And one thing that you'll see that's consistent between smaller and larger hacks is that they tend not to be just one thing that happens. So there's something that starts with something quite innocent, maybe like somebody's clicking on a phishing link and puts in their credentials, but then that allows somebody to get kind of a foothold on the network. And then over time, they're able to understand more about the network and then start to get into other systems. So it's really a combination of things, and in a sense, the defense mechanism, which we'll talk about, is just making sure that you reduce as many of these kind of exposures as possible. So let's talk about sort of the 5 most common security issues, starting with a really common one, which is phishing.
So, phishing, as a quick background, is one of the most prevalent, I guess, hacks in this case, in that it's a true numbers game. So, a recent report from Verizon, this was actually their 2019 data breach report, actually said 32% of all data breaches involve phishing. So, that's an email link that involves installation of malware, or just trying to capture your credentials for either servers or email systems. And to our earlier point, it is a numbers game. Hundreds of thousands, millions of these messages are sent daily, weekly, monthly, and it only requires a single link, one success, to the point that only 3% of these links are clicked, but it only takes that one instance. So, to kind of put a finer point on it, while only 3% of these links are ever clicked, it still accounts for 32% of all data breaches.
We're seeing more sophistication from the hackers trying to basically gain control over an account, which gives them that foothold. This is an example. There's a great sort of site called phishing.org. That's, of course, spelled with the phishing.org. And they have great sort of tips and tricks in terms of figuring out how an email is legitimate or not. And this particular example is quite interesting, but because what they're trying to do is they're trying to catch you off guard. So they're saying, hey, there's unusual sign-in activity, and it looks like it's coming from Microsoft. It has a outlook.com address, which a lot of people, of course, associate with Microsoft. And it says there's unusual sign-in activity. The link goes to a page that looks like you're logging into Google. Now, of course, in the story of the previous slide, they would send you to something that looked exactly like the Microsoft slide. And this is really where you are, on the verge of making, a big mistake. If you type in your email address and password, not looking at the address at the top, which, to be honest, I mean, more sophisticated users nowadays are kind of trained to do, but you have to have that level of understanding of what's going on throughout your firm. So you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if there's one person in the firm, well, then that whole foothold idea sort of happens, and that's where things start.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I would specifically point out is these two examples are real world examples of phishing experiences, and they are becoming more and more lifelike. They're becoming real. I believe, or in my opinion, phishing maybe 2 years ago, we would start and look at grammar. We would look at things that felt unreal, that they were using old logos. They weren't conforming to the Microsoft or the Google ideals. But in this case, as we can see with this Google example, they're using all the right stuff. They're using the right icons, the right logos to kind of lull us into this false sense of security.
They're just sort of tricking the user into thinking that email address that comes from something outlook.com is Microsoft themselves. And to be honest, a lot of spam filters nowadays, I mean, they don't analyze an email and say, well, is this really a Google link or a Microsoft link? And there are some more advanced services out there which we implement for our clients that do that, but that goes beyond what you'd consider your traditional sort of spam filtering uh, type of function.
So the second piece that we really wanted to focus on is this is an accident. It's lost or stolen mobile devices. With the rise of remote work, telecommuting, and just people wanting to have access to their data while they are traveling, the tablet, use the smartphone, iOS, iPad, what have you, has risen to become more and more integrated in our everyday lives. But unfortunately, these are the things that are a lot easier to leave behind in an Uber or unfortunately being stolen from us. 18% of these incidents where there is a data issue involve the loss of documents or devices. That also coming from that Verizon data breach report. These are the things that are starting to contain more and more of our critical data. So when we were discussing previously the idea of what data is, it is a growing trend that our capital D data is email. It is those pieces of communication where there's privileged information, sometimes just people's names, their email addresses, their phone numbers, being easily gone back and forth through email, calendar information. And some firms are wanting to be able to access their servers remotely by utilizing software, be it Google Drive, Dropbox, any of the Microsoft suites, be it SharePoint or otherwise. And these are residing on our devices. So when we have an issue where something is lost or stolen, many times we're unable to wipe or lock them down remotely because many of these consumer solutions, such as Apple's Find My iPhone or Find My iPad, require user interaction. The most important thing is you have to turn it on. It's when do we actually go through and click that button and say yes. But then also, we have to remember our password or remember what account we utilized. And when we get into further topics, sometimes that's just time where we are going back and forth. We're working with Apple. We're waiting for these account timeouts because we've tried the wrong password too many times.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go and shift gears a little bit to another sort of important security exposure that we see in a lot of smaller businesses, and that is the extraction of data from the inside. So the first two examples are talking about sort of quote bad actors, looking to get your information. Well, sometimes the threats are inside, and it can be obviously an employee that is disgruntled It can also be a lot less insidious. It may not necessarily be somebody that's looking to do damage to you, but maybe they're looking to line their own pockets by moving jobs. We see this frequently with people in a new business position or sales position. The lists that a company has of potential clients, of their own clients, it's a very easy thing for that Excel spreadsheet or that document to get copied onto a USB drive, a flash drive, or even somebody just logs into Dropbox or, from their computer and then drags and drops the file, they close it, and then, you as the owner of the business don't know any better. And so there are ways of dealing with this that we'll talk about. But one of the things that we found is that larger organizations have a lot stricter controls over who has access to what data. Most smaller firms have one server, and maybe they'll have a section of it that's cordoned off for only sort of the partners or accountants that have more personal information or whatnot. But the rest of it's sort of open to anyone that's got a login. So there are a lot of techniques to sort of help and detect this, and also sort of protect and cordon off this important data, that needs protection. So.
And then going back to our previous example and this situation that came to us where an entire company's core systems were locked down via ransomware, time is of the essence. A Cisco cybersecurity report actually reported 85% of all intrusions aren't discovered for weeks, which gives all of these kind of bad actors, these people, time to lay their groundwork. So if someone does accidentally fall for a phishing experience and they provided their credentials, we need to ensure that we're acting quickly. These days, good reaction time is minutes, it is hours, it is not weeks and days, because we want to make sure that this data that we have essentially just given out is locked down as quickly as possible. And as it comes to mean, there are some new laws in effect in Massachusetts specifically.
That's right. And that's the last of our sort of five security issues to highlight. It's not necessarily knowing your requirements. So this is less technical, but the law around data breaches is fast moving. Just in April of this year, the state of Massachusetts basically put into place the data breach notification law. And clearly, this is aimed at the larger Capital Ones, but it applies to all businesses, and it applies to any business that has personal information. Well, there are regulations that you have to, as a business, no matter how big, you have to abide by. And those require notifications to the state themselves and the residents that are affected. And of course, who's affected? Well, you need to have record of where that data is from, whose data that is, or else you essentially can't abide by the law. And the law basically states that you have to send these as written notices as soon as practicable and without unreasonable delay. And that really goes back to the point at the very beginning that I talked about planning, being able to react to a hack, and if there's data that's lost, you have to sort of do a set of things, not only to protect your data, potentially, change passwords or things like that, but you also have to, do the paperwork, do the admin, or there could be sort of heavy fines and, for that, not doing, the required activities. So that's sort of another thing that we see, nowadays.
Now, our intent of this webinar is not to fill you with dread and fear, but it's what can we do? So there are opportunities, there are easy things, quote unquote, that we can do to reduce our attack surface and make sure that it is less likely that we would experience a massive data breach or a ransomware event. So we've brought it down to 7 techniques, 7 things that you can bring to your IT provider or do internally to make sure you are as protected as possible.
So, the first thing to do is to map your assets and data, and assets being really your devices and the things that people use on a day-to-day basis that might interface with your critical information. And like Adam was saying earlier, that actually could include mobile phones, iPhones. It could include personal devices that have email on it. I mean, it's essentially just an exercise in cataloging all that. And we've done this exercise for quite a few firms, and it's very difficult when you have much larger firms, because you're talking about 100 employees and then potentially all their devices that have these accounts. For smaller firms, it's not actually that much heavy lifting. It's really just thinking about and talking to the people that do interface with confidential information, which nowadays is probably most of your employees. So where are email accounts, automatically downloading onto different devices and whatnot? And what is the data, and how critical is it to protect that particular data, from somebody being able to take it?
Now, once you've completed that exercise and you understand all of the machines that are accessing your data, it's really, really important that we scan for malware and viruses on 100% of those machines. Going back to our previous conversation about the client that came to us, again, this was not a machine that was high up. It wasn't an account executive. It wasn't someone who is accessing these critical pieces of information all the time. It was a machine in a warehouse. It was a machine that was just being utilized for checking email and very light work. But in this case, it had a phishing attempt on it and it worked. And from there, it had access to the entire network. So in this case, it's very easy to say, you know what, we have malware, we have all of our different security softwares on our core systems, the stuff that is touching these things all the time. Unfortunately, we found that that's not acceptable anymore. We need to have it on 100% of the machines that are connecting to our networks, but also our data, our infrastructure.
The third technique is to implement, and this is a mouthful, data exfiltration detection. And so this goes back to the idea of insiders taking data that you don't necessarily want them to. And there are a number of different platforms and software, and it's not particularly expensive, that can understand if there is a large amount of data being pulled. Of course, like, one file being sent via email, it's hard to detect that it's any different than any other. But certainly the places where there's been a lot more exposure for the firm, it's been when somebody takes many files, and offloads them to a cloud service. And there's lots of different software and techniques that will allow you to understand if this activity is happening, log that activity, and of course some of it may be completely legitimate, but at least you can look into it, in conjunction with your IT provider to see, hey, is this a normal activity? Should somebody be using SharePoint on their machine to pull files across? Okay, well, we know the situation around that. That's fine, but it's good to understand where this data is moving and when, so that you can ask those questions and be able to, I think, detect the real anomalies.
Mm-hmm. And I know Mike touched on this, that some of these larger enterprise companies have really advanced ways of doing this that sometimes border on draconian. These pieces of detection software, these processes will be able to ensure that your staff are able to still do the work they need to do. They're able to touch these files, but you're not opening yourself up to risk. And that actually ties in with the next item, which is implementing MDM. So MDM in this case is mobile device management. And this is a tool that will not only integrate with our kind of true mobile device, where we have iPhones or iPads, but also laptops or desktops as well, so that when they are stolen, we can be able to, on an enterprise level, on a kind of business level, make sure that they're locked down. Or if they're really stolen, make sure that they're wiped. So these are softwares, these are services that we can partner to. So we have the ability to ensure that this is done at more of the kind of business level, the global level, and we're not relying on each user themselves to go through and set up an account or kind of verify and make sure that they know all these various passwords.
And then the next step, or the next technique, is to train staff on detecting phishing emails. Now, obviously, the best case scenario is that everybody in the firm is aware of these different techniques, how to see if a link is going to where it's supposed to be, how to look at the at the URL as they call it, in the web browser to make sense of whether or not it's the right thing. There are sort of services that TSP implements that essentially test users, so send effectively sort of fake phishing, and if somebody clicks on it, then we get a report. They didn't detect it, it got through their filters. Focus a little bit more education there. And so I think there are ways of making sure that you can reduce that risk of people clicking on it. In addition to other layers, like we talked about earlier when we were talking about phishing, that can also help to at least detect if somebody's clicked on a link. And I think even if somebody does click on it, the other thing that we found that's tremendously effective is if there's education and training, so that there's a little voice in their head. They typed in a username and password, and 10 minutes later, they realize, oh man, I just made a mistake. There actually is a little bit of training around saying, hey, don't hide your mistake, because it really is about reaction time in minutes, in hours, doing what we can to mitigate the damage. So if somebody realizes that they've typed in their username and password and they've realized it wasn't a real email, that's really helpful for us to react, because you don't have to change every single password for every account if we react quickly and understand what accounts that's linked to, when you type in your username and password.
And for those who are maybe current clients and have heard me yell about this in the past, I will continue standing on my soapbox that regular training is important. Because, to Mike's point, we want to create that kind of voice in the back of their heads that has them understand what phishing is and what it does, but also make sure that when we do have new staff joining the firm, they receive the same sort of training. They receive the same amount of education as everybody else. So we make sure that our firms are really 100%. But then it's creating a playbook. In our goal of having a reaction time in minutes, in hours, not in days, we want to make sure that we have the clear steps of what everyone is doing and what we're doing in the event that there is something that happens. When somebody reports a phishing attempt that was successful, what do we do? If there are early warning signs of a ransomware event, who's kind of pulling the plug on that system? Who's disconnecting it from the network, disconnecting it from power? And having all of these systems and processes written down will ensure that we know exactly what is happening and in the order, so nothing is missed. So we don't go through and think that, hey, we did a great job, but unfortunately we have left ourselves open for maybe a critical account or a critical system.
And then the final related technique is to know your responsibilities. Even in a small firm, it makes sense to have somebody who's in charge of IT security. And that, of course, doesn't mean that they're an expert in cybersecurity. It just means that they're the critical link between your firm and the IT provider, so that when an issue is happening, everybody knows sort of what their responsibilities are, what they should be doing, who should they be communicating with, and you sort of streamline that process. So that's, once again, part of the playbook, but it is just overall part of this planning process of understanding what roles everybody takes in the process. But there's a lot of communication, even just the reporting and those types of things that I've talked about, that needs to be done internally, and those are things that should be defined up front rather than in reacting to a situation.
So we've chatted about what are the 7 things that we can do internally, but how can your IT provider help? To Mike's point, having the person that is maybe responsible for IT security doesn't mean that they're an expert. It doesn't mean that they need to know everything. It's that they need to know what to do and when. And some of the time it's partnering with your IT provider, partnering with TSP to make sure that these things get done.
Yeah, and I think there are, you sort of listed 4 specific ways that your IT provider, be it TSP or another firm, can help. What's important is just to start this dialogue. A lot of it is about the planning, but a lot of it's about understanding what other technical layers can be put into place in order to make sure that you're really addressing those 7 different techniques. The first is really just, from an IT support standpoint, you want a help desk, you want somebody that you can call that's trustworthy and approachable. It seems kind of obvious, right? Everybody, you should have a good firm that you trust, that you can talk to them about these security issues. But what we found is that if the interactions between the everyday staff and the help desk are not particularly things that people want to do, very few people are going to raise their hand and say, oh, I accidentally clicked on a phishing link and I typed in my username and password. So having this friendly relationship, one where people are willing to sort of say this and people are trained, people understand what the relationship is and how it works, really helps to make sure that if there is something that happens, or maybe even if somebody has a question, I got this weird email, can you guys look at it before I click on the links? And a lot of the time it is perfectly legitimate, but it's always good to have a second pair of eyes, looking at that.
So this next one is a little bit of a TSP-ism. It's having a good stack. So what we mean by that, it's having all the tools at your fingertips. So that's making sure that we have systems that are actively doing mobile device management or creating and updating network maps, but also malware scanning, exfiltration detection. It's ensuring that we have all the systems that are working together to make sure that we are protected at any given time.
And then the third area that an IT provider can help is to really help with that documentation. These are the devices that we have. This is where our data is. And then within that data, you find and protect the PI, or the personal identifiable information. That's the really critical stuff. And of course, you want to update that documentation on a regular basis, which becomes really part of that responsibility of the IT provider.
And then lastly, the creation of those playbooks is so, so important. This is something that your IT provider can take the lead on and help you create those playbooks of what happens when this happens, what happens when someone is phished, what are the 7 steps we need to do. But then performing regular testing is very, very important. I will say partnering that with regular phishing training is allowing us to ensure that everybody is understanding the policies, understanding what phishing looks like these days, and then making sure that they've absorbed that. By partnering with services that attempt to trick our staff, it allows us to understand where we still have room for improvement without necessarily going through and saying, hey, public shame, so-and-so clicked this. It's allowing more of that personal relationship.
We do have a couple questions that have been submitted via our little interface here. I'll take the first one, and maybe Adam, you can take the second. Mm-hmm. So I did sort of touch on this a little bit about, shouldn't my spam filter block phishing? And, we talked about that a little bit earlier. One of the things that we've implemented for clients that are more security conscious, it's not a spam filter. Like I said, those spam filters are always playing that cat and mouse game. But this software, basically, when you click on a link, it matches that link against a known database of sort of evil links. So if somebody has just registered a new domain, that domain is being used for phishing techniques, then and that database is shared through millions of computers and millions of clicks. And so there's a little bit of artificial intelligence and trying to figure out what are good and bad. It can keep that link from going through. And it does that not only on machines at work, can protect an entire network, but also laptops as well. So there are more advanced systems that can kind of help add this layered security, which is really the theme of, from a technical standpoint, how we tend to address cybersecurity. Not one single layer is going to solve everything, but hopefully all of these things together will keep the worst from happening.
And then next question will actually link up with another one that just came in. This one is, if someone has phished me, does that mean I've been hacked? Should I update all my passwords? And then another one that just came in regarding password security and what do we do with everything. In this case, if someone is phishing you actively, as long as you haven't clicked that link, you're fine. You don't have to worry about how this is going. Again, only 3% of those phishing links are actively clicked, which means that there are millions and millions and millions of these messages going out on a weekly basis. So if you see something or someone alerts you that someone is kind of impersonating you, as long as you didn't click that link, you're fine. But that actually brings us to a different question that is still really important, and that's password security. So, one of the things that we have talked about internally with some of our clients, but on TSP's podcast, the Grepcast, we talk about actually quite frequently, is the idea of password management. I know historically people have felt comfortable like putting all their passwords in like a Word document and then password protecting that, or just reusing the same password everywhere because it's easier to remember. By partnering with a password management software, be it one password that's the actual letter number one and then password or LastPass, it's actually not a bad idea to create custom and different passwords for everything. Yes, while it is a little cumbersome, it allows us to reduce that risk. Yes, we go through, we click that link where our email credentials are compromised. In that case, we're only needing to change one password because everything else is different.
Yeah, and I think that's once again part of the planning process. If you sort of know, like, when your email, if your email does get hacked and you type in that username and password, well, what is that email linked to? Many of us have all of these cloud accounts, and we have an email address that's set up as a recovery address, which basically means if somebody goes to Dropbox and they say, I forgot my password, then a link gets sent to your email, and then you can click and reset that password. Now, as somebody that might have gotten hacked, you would see that activity of somebody trying to do that. But it is certainly possible, for some of these activities to happen without it being very visible. And so knowing what accounts are associated with your email address, which nowadays is a lot of things, and then also knowing what accounts share that password. These password systems like one password or LastPass, they kind of automate this process. But at the very least, if you have a single password on the most critical account that you have, and then you have other passwords which are shared, and you at least understand which passwords are with which account, then it gives us as the IT provider something to work from. We don't have to change everything unless your email contained that magic Word document that had all your passwords. But it's really just a matter of understanding enough to just reduce that attack surface and mitigate as much as possible.
Another question that just came in. If you suspect an employee is disgruntled, are there mechanisms to monitor their activity to identify suspicious behavior? Yes, that goes back to that data exfiltration detection software. So TSP, we partner with a specific vendor to run through this. It will allow us to customize filters to hopefully identify events where they may be offloading data, where they may be copying and emailing themselves large amounts of systems. And we can definitely customize that on a per user basis if desired. But that's going to be your best bet. I wouldn't say that there is a other silver bullet type approach where it's maybe monitoring them. I would say data exfiltration detection is going to be your best bet in that manner.
Absolutely. And then another question that just came in was, what about using suggested passwords from the browser? Is that a sort of equivalent to some of these tools? And actually, so both Safari on sort of on the Mac as well as Google's Chrome have built-in password management systems. They essentially will propose a new password for you. They'll save a password that you type in or that it generates for you. In theory, those things work the same as 1Password or LastPass, but the only thing to be very cognizant about there is that those systems and the passwords that are stored tend to be linked to an account. So in the case of Google Chrome, that password database is linked to your Google account. So if your Google account gets hacked, then yeah, I mean, your passwords may end up being opened up because essentially that database is in one place. Same thing with Apple Safari. It's associated with your iCloud account. There's one very effective tool in both cases, and that's the use of what's called two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. Both Google as well as Apple have that service. So if you use the built-in password management of a browser, just make sure you have that multi-factor authentication turned on for the appropriate account.
Okay, so again, I want to thank everybody for attending our webinar today. We will actually be sending a PDF version of this presentation for you to have. Included is some are some references of some of the things that we have talked about today, both the Verizon and Cisco reports, but also actually 2 episodes of TSP's podcast. This is something that Mike and I, and then our project manager, Kelly Ford, we do on a bi-weekly basis. And we actually talk about phishing. We talk about cybersecurity quite frequently, along with some more technology adjacent items that are more interesting to the ecosystem as a whole, but included are 2 really, really interesting examples of phishing and cybersecurity when they unfortunately go bad. We will actually be following up this series with additional webinars in the future. So keep an eye out on our website, tsp.me, for what comes next. And if you do have any questions about partnering with a IT firm with some of these items, feel free to drop us a line. You can also find that information and tons of other things, again, over on our website at www.tsp.me. And we'll talk to you all soon.